August 1944. Somewhere above the Philippine Sea, in the hours between midnight and first light, the darkness that Japanese commanders had long relied upon as a natural ally began to betray them. The night had always belonged to the disciplined warrior, to the man trained to move without light, to strike without warning, to use the hours of blindness as a cloak that technology could not penetrate. Japanese naval doctrine had been built, in part, around this conviction. Night operations were a specialty, a point of institutional pride, a dimension of warfare in which rigorous training and spiritual preparation could compensate for material disadvantage. The darkness was supposed to be an equalizer. It was supposed to be safe. And then the aircraft came anyway. They came not in the careless, groping way of crews flying blind and hoping. They came with purpose, with precision, with the calm authority of men who could see what the darkness was supposed to conceal. The engines were audible before the aircraft were visible, a sound that carried across the water with a regularity that felt almost administrative, as though the war were being conducted according to a schedule that did not recognize the distinction between day and night. For the Japanese officers on the bridges of their ships, for the commanders in their operations rooms studying charts by lamplight, for the anti-aircraft crews who trained their weapons at a sky they could not read, the realization arrived slowly, and then all at once. The Americans had abolished the night. They had taken the one remaining sanctuary that geography and physics had seemed to guarantee and filled it with engines, with radar, with the organized will of a nation that did not believe in rest. To understand what this meant, one must return to the assumptions that had shaped Japanese air and naval strategy from the war's first days. Japan had entered the conflict with an air arm that was, in several respects, genuinely formidable. The aviators of the Imperial Navy and Army had been forged through training programs of exceptional severity, programs that accepted only a fraction of applicants, that demanded physical and psychological endurance beyond what most Western air forces required, and that produced in their graduates pilots of remarkable individual skill. The Zero fighter had given those pilots an instrument worthy of their training. In the opening campaigns of the war, Japanese air power had performed at a level that shocked its opponents and confirmed, within Japan's military establishment, a belief in qualitative superiority that would prove both accurate in 1941 and catastrophically misleading in 1944. Because the Americans had spent the intervening years doing what Japan's planners had underestimated: learning, adapting, building, and resting not at all. The American approach to the air war in the Pacific was, at its foundation, an industrial and institutional argument. It was the argument that a democratic nation, once committed to a military objective, would organize its entire productive capacity around that objective with an efficiency and scale that no opponent relying on a narrower resource base could sustain over time. By 1944, American aircraft production had reached numbers that Japanese planners found difficult to process as strategic reality. The United States was producing, in a single month, more aircraft than Japan could produce in a quarter. The training pipeline for American aviators had been industrialized to match. Thousands of pilots moving through a system that had been designed, with deliberate engineering, to produce competent combat airmen at a rate that could absorb losses and still expand. When a Japanese pilot was lost in 1944, the experience and training he carried died with him, because the Japanese system had no mechanism to replace it at scale. When an American pilot was lost, another, equally trained and freshly rested, was already moving through the pipeline to take his place. The arithmetic was not cruel, it was simply arithmetic. But it was the nighttime dimension of American air operations that most profoundly unsettled Japanese commanders in the Pacific's later years. Night air operations required capabilities that went beyond the courage and skill of individual crews. They required radar, the ability to navigate, to find targets, and to assess results without visual reference. They required instrument flying of a standard that only systematic, sustained training could produce. They required ground and carrier control systems that could manage aircraft in darkness, coordinate attacks, and bring crews safely back to ships or airfields that were themselves invisible from altitude. All of these requirements have been systematically addressed by the American military and industrial establishment through 1942 and 1943, largely without Japanese awareness of the scale of the investment being made. The radar sets being fitted to American night fighters and bombers by 1944 were not experimental prototypes. They were mature, reliable, mass-produced instruments that had been refined through operational experience and were now available in quantities sufficient to equip entire air groups. The night carrier operations at the USS Independence and later dedicated night carrier air groups pioneered in 1944 represented something that Japanese naval doctrine had not anticipated and could not quickly counter. The concept was straightforward in its ambition and extraordinarily demanding in its execution. A carrier, or a carrier air group, specially trained and equipped, would conduct continuous operations through the night hours, maintaining combat air patrols, conducting strikes against enemy positions, and denying Japanese commanders the operational pause that darkness had previously provided. The pilots selected for night carrier operations were among the most skilled in the American naval aviation establishment. They flew approaches to carrier decks they could not see in any conventional sense, guided by instruments, by radio, by the disciplined coordination of controllers who had trained for precisely this task. The margin for error was negligible. The psychological demand was severe, and the effect on the enemy was, by the documented record of Japanese commanders' responses, something close to a sustained dread. Japanese after-action reports from the latter half of 1944 return repeatedly to a theme that sits between tactical analysis and something rawer, the language of men confronting it, experience for which their training had not prepared them. The reports describe aircraft appearing without warning in conditions that should have prevented operations. They describe radar signatures that materialized and then struck before adequate response was possible. They describe the particular exhaustion of crews and commanders who had previously used the night hours to regroup, to repair, to plan, and who now found those hours invaded by the same relentless pressure that daylight brought. Sleep, in the operational calculus of a military force under sustained air attack, is not a luxury. It is a component of combat effectiveness as real as ammunition or fuel. When the Americans took the night, they did not merely add hours to the operational day. They began a systematic assault on the human capacity for endurance that the Japanese military, stretched already by 3 years of attritional warfare, was not positioned to absorb. The specific engagements that defined this reality accumulated through the summer and autumn of 1944 with a cumulative weight that individual accounts cannot fully capture. During the Marianas Campaign in June 1944, the operation that Japanese planners had designated as the decisive engagement that would reverse the war's momentum, American night operations played a significant role in disrupting the coordinated strikes that the Imperial Navy had spent months preparing. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which American aviators would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was a catastrophe for Japanese carrier aviation by any measure. In 2 days of fighting, Japan lost approximately 400 aircraft and 3 carriers, while American losses were a fraction of that total. The causes were multiple: superior American fighter direction, better trained American pilots, the protective effect of the proximity fuse on American ships. But the exhaustion factor, the inability of Japanese crews to use the preceding nights for genuine rest and preparation, contributed to a degraded operational effectiveness that the kill ratios reflected. Rear Admiral Suio Obayashi, commanding one of the Japanese carrier divisions of the Philippine Sea, submitted a report afterward that documented the disorientation his forces had experienced in the face of continuous American pressure. The language was controlled, as the language of Imperial Japanese military reporting was required to be, but the substance was clear. His forces had been unable to achieve the coordinated, rested state that the operations plan had assumed. The Americans had not given them the time. The Americans had not given them the night. The sound of an aircraft engine in darkness carries differently than in daylight. In daylight, it is one element among many in the sensory landscape of a ship at sea or a base on a Pacific island. Present, noted, evaluated alongside visual information and radar returns and the practiced assessments of experienced watchstanders. In darkness, heard before anything is seen, it carries a weight that is partly tactical and partly something older, the weight of the unknown approaching from a direction the eyes cannot confirm. Japanese sailors and soldiers who lived through the sustained night air operations of 1944 described this sound in terms that went beyond tactical reporting. It was the sound of a war that would not pause. It was the sound of an enemy who had organized his industrial and human resources so thoroughly that he could maintain offensive pressure through every hour of the day and night without, apparently, running short of either machines or the men to fly them. Against the Bushido ideal of the warrior who transcends physical limitation through spiritual will, the Americans had offered a different proposition, a democracy that had converted its extraordinary productive freedom into a military machine capable of sustaining what no individual will, however fierce, could indefinitely resist. The C-ration tin, that compact, olive-drab container of processed food that American servicemen carried through every theater of the war, was not, in itself, a weapon, but it represented, in its modest and practical way, the same productive logic that kept the aircraft flying through the night. It was the product of an industrial food system so efficient and so abundantly supplied that it could feed millions of men in the most remote and difficult operational environments on Earth without apparent strain. Japanese soldiers who encountered these rations in capture positions or during the island campaigns of 1944 and 1945 were, by multiple documented accounts, struck not by their quality. American field rations were not universally admired, but by their quantity, their regularity, and the implication of their existence. A military that could feed its men this consistently, this abundantly, even here, even now, was a military whose supply lines and productive base had not been broken and were not going to be broken. The tin can was an argument in metal and processed food. This nation has more than enough, and it will keep coming. The transformation that the endless air war produced in Japanese strategic consciousness was gradual and, for those experiencing it, deeply disorienting. The ideology of Imperial Japan's military culture had been constructed around the principle that spiritual quality could overcome material quantity, that the disciplined, spiritually prepared warrior could, at the decisive moment, compensate for whatever advantage the enemy held in machines and supplies through the superior application of will and training. This principle had not been merely rhetorical. It had been tested in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, in which Japan had defeated a materially larger opponent through precisely this combination of tactical brilliance and moral determination. The principle had worked. The precedent was real, and it had created an institutional memory that the very different conditions of 1944 were rendering dangerously obsolete. The Americans were not the Russian Imperial Army. Their material advantage was not the kind that could be overcome at a decisive point because it was not concentrated at any point. It was distributed across the entire operational environment, available at any hour, replenishable at a rate that no tactical victory could meaningfully reduce. Japanese commanders who survived the war and reflected on its course have described the period of sustained night air operations as a moment of particular psychological significance. Not because any single engagement was decisive, but because the cumulative realization was inescapable. The enemy was not going to rest. The enemy had organized his national life in such a way that rest. The enemy had organized his national life in such a way that rest, for the military machine, was not a requirement in the same sense that it was for Japan's depleted, overstretched forces. The factories ran at night. The carriers operated at night. The pilots flew at night, and behind all of it was a productive and organizational system rooted in the freedom of a democratic society to mobilize its citizens' energies voluntarily, on a scale and with an efficiency that command economies and spiritually motivated military cultures alike had consistently underestimated. The last night of the Pacific War came in August 1945, in silence rather than in the sound of engines. The silence was its own kind of statement, The statement of a machine that had been running without pause for 4 years and had now, having accomplished what it set out to accomplish, gone quiet. The men who had kept it running, the night carrier pilots, the radar operators, the controllers, the mechanics who worked by flashlight on flight decks rolling in Pacific swells, did not, for the most part, reflect on what they had done in the language of ideology or symbol. They reflected on it in the language of men who had been very tired for a very long time and were now, at last, permitted to sleep. But the truth of what they had done did not require their reflection to be real. They had demonstrated, in 4 years of continuous operations across the largest ocean on Earth, that freedom is not merely a political arrangement. It is a productive force. It is the force that keeps the factories running when the shift changes, that fills the training pipeline when the losses mount, that puts aircraft in the sky at 3 in the morning when every human instinct argues for stillness and rest. The darkness that Japanese commanders had counted on as an ally turned out to be no ally at all, because the civilization they were fighting had decided, with the quiet determination of a people who understood what was at stake, that it would not honor the distinction between day and night. It would simply keep coming, and it did, until there was nothing left to come for.